Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we take your complex sources, strip away the jargon, and deliver the essential insights you need to navigate history's most fascinating systems. Today, we are traveling back to the heart of Rome. But we're not talking legions or emperors this time. We're exploring one of their most telling legal concepts.
That's right. We're doing a deep dive into Iniuria. Now, if you hear that word today, you probably think injury, right? Physical harm.
Yeah, seems obvious.
But for the Romans, Iniuria was, well, it was much bigger. It was really the law of outrage. It's a whole legal framework that went way beyond, broken contracts or even just physical assault. It was fundamentally designed to protect a citizen's honor, their dignitas, their public standing.
And that's really the core mission for you, our listener, in this dive. To get your head around how a civilization actually tried to legally codify the value of someone's self-worth. We're looking at a system where an attack on your reputation, your status, that could be seen as just as bad, maybe even worse, than getting physically hurt.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating, I think, is the inherent tension here. You've got this legal system that's, on the one hand, sophisticated enough to recognize this really intangible harm, a blow to dignity. But on the other hand, it was incredibly pragmatic. It evolved, from these really old fixed laws where, say, a broken bone literally had a set price tag.
Like from the 12 Tables era.
Exactly. It moved from that to a system that became highly discretionary. The penalty started depending entirely on the context, who was involved, their social status, all of it.
So we want to unpack how the Romans pulled this off. We'll trace this law from its early roots, maybe in property disputes, all the way to these high-stakes scenarios of public shaming and political maneuvering. By the end of this conversation, you should have a really clear sense of how defending dignitas was, well, arguably one of the most critical legal functions in Roman society. Okay, so to really get in Iniuria, we probably need to lay the groundwork first, right? Look at how Romans initially handle harm, the more tangible stuff. And that brings us back to the Lex Achillia.
Right, the Lex Achillia. This law goes way back, 3rd century BCE. And its primary focus, initially at least, was liability for physical harm, especially harm to property. And because Roman law, well, it treated slaves and certain animals as property.
Right.
A lot of the early cases we see discussed revolve around damage done to them. And the system at the start was very outcome-focused.
Outcome-focused. What does that mean exactly? Like, did it matter what the person intended to do?
Well, initially, surprisingly little, actually. The law was super pragmatic. It was about compensating for the quantifiable loss. Let's take a classic example, mistaken identity. Say you kill my slave. Under the Lex Achillia, you're liable. Full stop. Now, this liability, after true, even if you genuinely, honestly believed that slave was actually a free man attacking you. Or maybe you just mistook him for someone else's slave you thought you had permission to punish. It doesn't matter why you were mistaken. The liability attaches because my property was destroyed. Your intention, even if blameless, or your mistake, irrelevant to the basic liability.
Wow, okay. That feels quite different from modern law, where the mens rea, the guilty mind, is usually so central. It really sounds like the Romans were just focused on balancing the books, financially speaking, for the property owner.
That's a great way to put it. It aimed squarely at compensating the loss of value. And, this need to balance the books led to some really intricate legal footwork, especially when damage claims started to overlap.
Okay, give us the complexity. How did they stop someone from double dipping if their property got damaged twice in the same incident?
Okay, let's stick with the slave example. It illustrates it well. Say you wound my slave badly, but he recovers.
Right.
I could bring a claim under the Lex Achillia for that wounding, get damages for, the temporary loss of his work, maybe vet bills, that sort of thing.
That makes sense.
But what if that slave, weeks or months later, actually dies from complications arising from that original wound?
Oh, okay. Now what?
Well, now I, the owner, could potentially sue again, this time for the killing. The damages for killing were usually higher, often based on the slave's peak value in the past year. The challenge for the courts was preventing what they called double recovery for what was, essentially, the same ultimate loss stemming from the one act.
So you can sue twice, but you can't end up getting paid more than the maximum value the slave represented.
Precisely. They had a procedural tool for this, the plea of fraud, the acceptio doli. If I, the owner, had already collected damages for the wounding and then I came back trying to sue for the full maximum value for the killing, the defendant could raise this plea. They'd argue that trying to get the full value again after already being compensated for the initial injury was acting, well, fraudulently or maybe just unfairly.
Dolus, malice, bad faith.
Exactly. And the court would likely uphold that plea. It wouldn't necessarily dismiss the second case entirely, but it would prevent me from recovering an amount that, when you added it to what I already got for the wounding, went over the statutory maximum allowed for the killing itself.
That's actually quite sophisticated. It's a clever way to cap the total liability, keeping the system focused on compensation, not letting the plaintiff get a windfall. It really shows their legal minds wrestling with these ideas of permanent versus temporary loss.
It absolutely does. And this whole concern over liability, who pays for what, extends right into something really fundamental: self-defense. Now, the Romans totally acknowledged, like basically all legal systems do, that you have a right to use force to defend yourself against violence. If you cause damage while defending yourself, generally you're considered blameless for that damage.
Seems straightforward enough.
But, and this is a big but, they put really strict limits on how you exercise that defense.
Okay, what were the lines you couldn't cross? What turned a justified defense into something you could be sued for?
The main things were necessity and intent. The force had to be necessary for the immediate defense. You couldn't use it for revenge, chase the guy down the street after the threat was over.
Right, has to be proportional and immediate.
Exactly. But the really fine point, the one that shows just how strict the lex Aquilia liability could be, involves accidental harm to a third party.
Ah, the classic scenario. I'm defending myself, I throw a rock at my attacker.
But you miss, and you hit some poor, innocent person just walking by.
Yeah, what happens then?
That's the textbook case the jurists loved. Even though your original action defending yourself was completely justified, even laudable, and even though you had absolutely no intention of harming the passerby, you are still liable under the lex Aquilia for the accidental harm caused to that innocent third party.
Wow. That feels really counterintuitive today, doesn't it? We put so much weight on whether you meant to do harm, on moral fault. Why would they hold you liable for the bystander?
It really boils down to causality and, again, that pragmatic focus on consequences. The Roman legal thinking went something like this. The moment you decide to use force, even justifiably in self-defense, you take on the inherent risk that comes with using force. Your blameless intent justifies the harm you might inflict on the aggressor. Their own illegal act sort of cancels out their right to complain.
Okay, that makes sense for the attacker.
But the harm done to the innocent bystander, that harm was caused solely by your action, your thrown stone. And since that bystander did absolutely nothing to forfeit their right to physical safety, the liability lands squarely on you. The system is basically saying, your right to protect yourself doesn't completely override an innocent person's right not to be harmed by your actions. If your self-defense accidentally hurts them, you bear the cost of making them whole.
So the lex Aquilia really establishes this philosophy of responsibility based heavily on the physical outcome, almost regardless of good intentions. Which, as you said, sets up a really dramatic contrast when we pivot to Iniuria. Because there, the legal focus seems to completely flip, and suddenly intention becomes the absolute key. Okay, let's make that pivot now. We're moving away from the world of, quantifiable loss, a broken leg, a damaged slave, things you can put a price on, into this much murkier but maybe more human realm of intangible harm. The blow to reputation, to dignity. This is Iniuria, the law of outrage.
Exactly. And in the context of Iniuria, the whole idea of liability did a complete 180. Here, whether someone was condemned depended almost entirely on their deliberate intent. Did they intend to insult, to defame, to degrade? Without that malicious intent, that animus inuriandi, the act often wasn't considered Iniuria at all, even if it looked like an insult on the surface.
So this is where we start talking about things like slander, libel, false accusations, that kind of thing.
Precisely. The sources themselves draw these parallels quite clearly. They point out that calumnia, which is basically bringing a false or malicious lawsuit, works just like furtum or theft. It hinges on intention. Think about it. If you sue someone and you lose your case, you weren't automatically penalized. You'd only face a penalty if the judge determined you brought that lawsuit in bad faith, mala fide.
Meaning you knew your claim was bogus and you were just doing it to harass the other person or damage their reputation.
Exactly. That element of deliberate malice, that wrongful intent, is what drives the offense in these cases.
Okay, so for Iniuria, the driving force is the intent to attack the victim's honor, their public standing, their dignitas. And what strikes me immediately is how broadly the Romans defined who the victim of that insult could actually be. It wasn't just the person who got punched or yelled at directly.
No, not at all. The reach of Iniuria was potentially huge. An insult could obviously be suffered directly by the person targeted, a clear, straightforward attack. But Crucially, it could also be suffered indirectly. This happens when the harmful act is done to someone connected to the primary person, and this whole indirect structure is really the legal system recognizing and protecting that dense network of honor that surrounded the Roman family.
Okay, let's break that down. Use the central figure of Roman family law, the paterfamilias, the head of the household. How did direct versus indirect insult work for him?
Right, so a direct insult would be one aimed squarely at the paterfamilias himself, or importantly, at the materfamilias, the mother of the family, who also held significant social standing, even if less legal power. An indirect insult, though, that's where it gets interesting. This is the legal idea that an outrage committed against anyone under the paterfamilias' legal power, potestas, or even just entitled to his affection and protection. Well, that insult reflected upwards onto him.
So who are we talking about here? Children, life.
Yes, definitely biological children still under his power. His wife, in Manu, if she was under his direct control, or even if not, her honor was linked to his. His daughter-in-law, living in the household, even, significantly, household slaves. An insult to them could be grounds for the paterfamilias to sue.
And the legal logic behind that action rested entirely on the idea that the offense against the subordinate actually damaged the honor of the family head. Is that right?
Absolutely spot on. The honor of the paterfamilias was seen as this kind of protective legal umbrella covering the whole household. If you insulted his unmarried daughter, maybe the direct harm to her was considered relatively minor in purely legal terms, especially if she had no property of her own. But the reflection on the father's ability to protect his household, the damage to his reputation, that was the primary actionable offense. The law wasn't really there to protect the daughter's feelings per se. It was there to protect the patriarch's dignitas.
And this focus, this prioritization of the head of household's honor leads to some really complex and, frankly, quite illuminating scenarios that show just how powerful that concept was. We've got this remarkable case involving a son who is sold.
Ah, yes, that's a fantastic example. It perfectly highlights how Roman law could value public honor even above private consent. So, imagine a situation. A son, still legally under his father's power, patria potestas, actually consents to being sold, perhaps into some form of bondage or maybe even technically slavery, by his father. Now, that transaction itself is legally complicated.
But let's say someone insults that son during the process of the sale, or uses the sale itself as a platform for publicly degrading the family.
Right. Here's the twist. Even if the son himself agreed to be sold, the father could still bring an action for Iniuria based on insults that happened during that process. The legal reasoning is quite sharp. The son's consent effectively cancels out any insult to the son himself. He agreed to the situation, so he can't claim he was personally outraged by the sale itself.
Okay, so the son has no case.
But the jurists explicitly state that the reflection on the father's honor remains actionable, regardless of the son's consent. The public degradation associated with selling one's son, or insults hurled during that public act, still tarnished the father's dignitas.
So the son's agreement might have made the transaction itself legally possible, and it wiped out his own claim for insult. But the public performance of it, the potential for degradation, still hit the father's reputation. The legal system is prioritizing the public image, the integrity of the father, over the details of the transaction, or even the son's willing participation.
It perfectly illustrates it. Iniuria wasn't ultimately about protecting the individual's subjective feelings. It was about protecting the societal perception of the family unit, as embodied by its head. The father's dignitas was treated as a more legally durable, more valuable commodity than the individual rights or feelings of the family members under his authority.
And this abstract shield, protecting the family's good name, it even reached beyond the grave, didn't it? Which has to be one of the most counterintuitive aspects of Iniuria. How can you possibly insult someone who's dead?
It is fascinating, isn't it? But yes, the law extended that far. If someone committed an outrage upon a corpse, say they desecrated the body or vandalized the tomb, or even if they attacked the deceased person's reputation after death through slander or defamation, the heir, or whoever possessed the deceased estate, bona, could bring an action for Iniuria.
But why? The dead person can't suffer embarrassment or loss of honor anymore.
The legal rationale remained perfectly consistent with the principle of indirect insult we just discussed. The outrage committed against the deceased was seen to reflect directly upon the honor and the reputation of the living heir. You have to remember, in Roman society, the heir wasn't just inheriting land or money. They were inheriting the family name, the social narrative, the status built up by their ancestors. So, an attack on the memory of an ancestor was viewed as a direct, legally actionable attack on the living family's claim to respect and standing in the community.
So Iniuria, in this sense, was basically the legal defense mechanism for the family legacy itself. It gave the living generation the tools to ensure that the memory of the dead, which was the very foundation of their current status, couldn't be trashed without consequence. That really hammers home the idea that honor in Rome wasn't just personal, it was this transgenerational, almost eternal commodity. Hashtag 33. The role of status and discretion in determining penalty.
Okay, so we've seen how broadly Iniuria defined the victim directly, indirectly, even posthumously. But the shift from defining the victim to figuring out the penalty, that's where Roman law really shows its cards, where its core values become crystal clear. If honor was the currency being protected, then social status was basically the exchange rate regulator. It determined the price of the offense. The law didn't just acknowledge social hierarchy, it actively baked it into the assessment of severity.
And we see that immediately when we look at offenses committed by slaves, right? People at the absolute bottom of the social ladder.
Absolutely. The legal texts are incredibly explicit about this. They flat out state that an insult increases in severity based on who caused it. An insult that might be considered pretty minor, maybe even dismissed, if it came from a free citizen. That same insult becomes serious, automatically actionable if it's inflicted by a slave. The low status of the perpetrator literally magnifies the offense.
That's a really powerful statement about how sacred they considered free status to be. The physical act might be identical, but the insult is worse just because the source is deemed so low.
Precisely. And because a slave was legally property, the procedure for getting any kind of compensation or satisfaction involved the specific rules for dealing with offenses committed by someone else's property, the noxal action.
Right. So the slave does the insulting, but it's the master who gets sued and has to deal with the legal consequences. What choices did the master actually have under this noxal action?
The master, not the slave, faced the formal legal liability.
Yeah. But they kept control over how to respond. They essentially had three main options. And these options were kind of designed to appease the person who'd been insulted while also protecting the master's own property interests in the slave.
Okay, what were these three choices, and what do they tell us about that balancing act between protecting property versus protecting dignity?
Okay, first, the simplest path. The master could just choose to pay whatever damages the court decided were appropriate for the insult. Straightforward compensation. Acts like an indemnity.
Makes sense. Pay up, move on. Second option, and this is where it gets really interesting, legally and socially. The master could choose to hand the slave over. This is the noxe deditio. Surrender the offending property to the person who is insulted. By doing this, the master completely wiped their own hands of any further liability. The slave then became the property of the insulted party.
Wow. That's pretty drastic for the slave, obviously, but it gets the master off the hook financially. What was the third way? You said there were three.
The third option was more about performance and appeasement through punishment. The master could offer to produce the slave to be whipped, publicly or privately, as a way to satisfy the insulted party's demand for retribution, for satisfaction of their wounded honor. But crucially, the sources add a nuance here. They say the master technically had the power to decide why the slave was being whipped. Maybe frame it internally as just discipline for misbehavior, rather than explicitly admitting the slave committed Iniuria.
So, saving face a bit.
Kind of. But, and this is key, the master ultimately had to yield if the person who suffered the insult wasn't satisfied by the whipping alone. If the victim didn't feel their honor was sufficiently restored by just seeing the slave punished, the master might still be pushed towards paying damages or even surrendering the slave.
So there's a real tension there. The law lets the master try to frame the punishment in terms of property discipline, but the ultimate benchmark is still the victim's subjective feeling of restored honor. It's like this delicate, formalized negotiation between property rights and the need to maintain the dignity of free citizens.
It is. And this idea of satisfying the victim, of assessing the level of outrage, leads directly into how penalties for Iniuria were determined more generally. Because unlike those early fixed penalties, the penalty for Iniuria became highly flexible. The Praetors' edict, which laid out the law, explicitly gave the judge or magistrate enormous discretion.
How is that discretion actually written into the law? What were the guidelines?
Well, the damages were formally stated to be in the discretion of the judge, arbitrio iudicis. But, and this is the profound part, they were to be fixed according to the standards of good and reasonable men, ex bono et aequo. That's not just a vague instruction, it's telling the judge they must consider all the circumstances. Where did the insult happen? What exactly was said or done? Was it daytime or nighttime? In public or private? And critically, what was the social standing, the dignitas of the person who was insulted. The judge wasn't just calculating financial loss, they were actively assessing the degree of social degradation involved.
In other words, shouting an insult at someone in the middle of the forum was way worse than muttering it in a back alley. And insulting a senator demanded a much, much higher penalty than insulting, say, a common shopkeeper, even if the words were identical. The law was inherently weighted by class.
Absolutely. It was explicitly class conscious. And this principle of judicial status differentiation became even more formalized as the empire went on, especially in the criminal courts that handled more serious offenses, the cognitio extra ordinem procedures. The entire punishment structure became visibly stratified.
How did that stratification play out? What were the different kinds of punishments for the upper versus lower classes?
You see this massive split between how they treated the elite, the honestiers, literally, the more honorable ones, and the lower ranks, the humiliors, the more humble ones. For the elite, the penalties tended to be what we might call social death rather than physical destruction. Things like exile, exilium, or relegation, being banished to a specific place, relegatio, maybe being barred from holding public office. Punishments that stripped them of their status in public life, but generally left their physical person untouched.
But for the common people, those without that high status shield, it was a different story.
A completely different story. Criminals from the lower ranks, the humiliors, faced harsh, physically degrading penalties, often described as servile punishments, the kind usually reserved for slaves. We're talking about things like opus publicum, hard labor on state projects like building roads or aqueducts, or even worse, damnatio ad metallum, condemnation to the mines, basically a death sentence through brutal forced labor. The law wasn't just punishing the act, it was physically reinforcing the social hierarchy. It preserved the bodies of the elite while literally conscripting the bodies of the poor into state service or destruction.
It's such a blatant acknowledgement that the purpose wasn't equal justice as we might think of it today, but the active maintenance of the existing social order. And alongside these formal penalties, we also see the enduring power of stigma, right? Social sanction.
Oh, absolutely. A legal judgment against someone, especially for something touching on honor or trustworthiness, often carried a lasting social consequence known as infamia. This wasn't always a formal penalty dictated by the judge, but more like a legal stain on your reputation. Infamia could severely restrict your ability to participate in civic life. You might lose the right to vote, to hold office, to represent others in court, even long after you'd served any formal sentence. For a Roman citizen whose identity was so tied to public life, losing your reputation through infamia could be far worse than the physical punishment itself.
Okay, one last point on penalties and procedure.
Hmm.
What about getting out of it? If someone insults me, but I decide, you know what, I'm just going to let it go,
Yeah.
does that legal option just vanish?
It vanishes in two main ways, according to the sources. First, the standard way, the passage of time. Like most legal actions, there was a statute of limitations, probably quite short for Iniuria, maybe a year. If you didn't sue within that time, your right expired.
Okay, typical legal stuff.
But the second way is uniquely Roman and really speaks to the nature of honor. The action could be nullified by deliberately swallowing the insult, dissimulatio. If the victim consciously chose to ignore the slight, to let it pass without taking any action, the law interpreted that inaction as a form of acceptance, almost like satisfaction. It was a formal legal recognition that choosing not to defend your honor when publicly attacked was, itself, a deliberate and final decision about your own status. You couldn't just ignore it for months and then suddenly decide to sue later when it suited you. You swallowed it, and the legal opportunity was gone. Hashtag tag 4, public affront, and the fight for honor. Greek parallels.
Now, this whole idea that honor is something you defend legally, something that can even be used as a weapon.
Yeah.
This wasn't just a Roman thing, was it? To really grasp the high stakes involved in public degradation in the ancient world, it's useful to look across the water to Athens and their concept of hubris.
Absolutely. Hubris in Athens wasn't just arrogance, like we use the term today. It specifically meant an insulting assault, often physical, done with the intent to shame and diminish the victim publicly. And the most famous, most spectacular case that shows the lethal political and social power wrapped up in hubris has to be the lawsuit brought by the great Athenian orator Demosthenes against his wealthy, powerful enemy, Midias. This wasn't just a fight over a punch. It was a battle for Demosthenes' public survival.
Okay, paint the picture for us. What exactly did Midias do that was so outrageous?
The core physical act was pretty simple. Midias struck Demosthenes in the face, a slap or a punch.
Okay, bad, but maybe not world-ending.
Ugh. But the insult wasn't just the physical blow itself. It was all about the context. where and when it happened, and who Demosthenes was at that moment. The incident took place during the Great Dionysia, which was one of Athens' biggest, most important religious and civic festivals, a huge public event. And Demosthenes wasn't just there as a private citizen, he was serving as a choregus. That meant he was a wealthy citizen chosen to sponsor and organize one of the dramatic choruses for the festival, a major public service, a liturgy. He was likely wearing the formal, possibly sacred robe associated with that office.
Oh, wow. Okay. So Medius didn't just hit a guy. He hit a public official performing a sacred duty during a major religious festival right in front of everyone.
Exactly. He transformed a personal assault into an act of public contempt. Contempt for the festival, contempt for the gods, contempt for the city's traditions, and contempt for Demosthenes in his official, respected role. The act became almost sacrilegious. Demosthenes sued for 30 minae, which was a massive amount of money, but he argued vehemently in his speech that the money was almost beside the point. The real issue is restoring his honor.
What were the actual stakes for Demosthenes personally? Why risk this huge, potentially nasty legal fight over what Medius probably tried to downplay as just a scuffle?
Demosthenes spelled it out. He argued he had to sue, he had no choice. Because if he just accepted this public affront, if he let Medius get away with it, he feared being covered with shame. And for a politician, a public figure in Athens, being seen as someone who couldn't or wouldn't defend his own honor was political suicide. It meant you lacked, Andrea, that essential quality of manliness, courage, and civic virtue. Tolerating Medius's hubris would destroy his credibility as a leader people could trust and respect.
How did Medius and his supporters try to counter that? How did they try to frame it differently?
They tried desperately to shrink it back down. Their main argument was, look, this is just part of a long-running private feud between me and Demosthenes. They argued that this kind of aggressive behavior, this jostling for status, the verbal attacks, even the occasional physical clash, it was just normal, routine stuff in Athens' highly competitive, agonistic society. Everyone was constantly competing for honor, philotimia. Medius was essentially telling the jury, hey, this is how we ambitious guys operate. Don't make a big public example out of me for playing the game.
But Demosthenes managed to win that argument, right? He successfully framed the injury as being fundamentally public, not just personal.
Yes, his argument was that the real victim here wasn't just Demosthenes the man, but the city of Athens itself, its laws, its religious obligations, its civic order. He elevated the crime from a personal spat to an attack on the community. And this whole struggle, this fight over how to define the nature of the crime, private versus public, it just perfectly shows how the Athenians, very much like the Romans with Iniuria, used their legal system as the ultimate battleground for defending or destroying personal status.
And that Athenian parallel brings us right back to Rome, and just how devastatingly powerful litigation could be there. It wasn't just about fines, it could inflict total social and financial ruin. We're talking about the weaponization of civil law in the service of personal vendettas.
Oh, absolutely. The legal process itself could be terrifyingly swift and brutal in destroying someone's entire standing. We have this incredible anecdote about a Roman senator, a guy named Q. Opimius. It really drives home how pursuing vengeance or even just asserting your rights through certain types of legal judgments could just vaporize a person's entire life in an instant.
What happened to Opimius? And why was his case so shocking that it apparently caused a stir in the Senate itself?
Well, Q. Opimius was described as a man of high rank, significant wealth, property status, all the ornaments of an elite Roman life. And yet, through some kind of legal judgment, the source implies it was likely a summary procedure. Very fast, he was recorded as losing everything. All his property, his entire fortune, all his status symbols, gone. And the most shocking part, it apparently happened in the space of just 3 hours.
3 hours. To go from wealthy senator to completely destitute. That suggests the judgment wasn't just harsh. It was executed with immediate, overwhelming force. No time to appeal, no time to negotiate.
Exactly. It implies a system where certain judgments could lead to immediate seizure and liquidation of assets. And the sheer speed and totality of this financial and social annihilation was apparently so horrifying, especially to other elites who suddenly saw their own vulnerability, that it led to serious debate in the Senate. There were calls to actually abolish that specific type of rapid, ruinous judgment altogether. It wasn't just the money Opimius lost, it was the profound public shame, the sudden stripping bare that sent a chill through the establishment. The law, when turned into a weapon, could erase an elite citizen's material existence, and by extension, their social value, almost instantly.
And we see this pattern elsewhere too, right? Proof that even if you were completely in the right legally, just defending yourself in court could be ruinously expensive.
Yeah, there's another example involving someone named Dio. He faced some kind of false allegation concerning property that had been forfeited to the state. Even though his rights to the property were apparently unquestionable, he was still forced to spend a huge sum, the source mentions £10,000, which must represent a vast fortune, simply to navigate the legal process and secure what was already rightfully his. The legal system itself, the cost and complexity of defending yourself, could become an enormous financial burden, easily wielded by opponents to bleed you dry or force you to settle. The courtroom was absolutely a battlefield for financial integrity and social survival.
And all this really circles back to that fundamental importance of honor and reputation, connecting directly to the expected standards of behavior in the ancient world. You mentioned the Greek ideal of Andreas earlier.
Right. These concepts of honor, dignitas in Rome, Andrea in Greece, they weren't just vague social ideals. They were deeply woven into legal and civic expectations. Athenian men, for example, were constantly judged against this ideal of Andrea. It demanded courage, particularly in military service, and active participation in contribution to the city. And if a man was seen to fall significantly short of those minimal standards, maybe he showed cowardice in battle, maybe he shirked his civic duties, he could face real, tangible public consequences.
Consequences that included not just social disapproval like ridicule or rebuke, but actual legal prosecution.
Yes, potentially. Depending on the failing, there could be formal processes like dokimasia, scrutiny for office, or even specific charges related to military misconduct or failing civic duties. The legal system in both Rome and Greece served as this ultimate formal mechanism for enforcing these high social and moral benchmarks. It was the final arbiter of whether an individual had successfully maintained the necessary dignitas or Andrea to be considered a full, respected member of the civic community. And the law of insult, Iniuria or hubris, was simply one of the sharpest tools available to ensure that status, once attained, was rigorously defended against any perceived attack. Hashtag tag outro.
So after this deep dive into Iniuria, I think it forces us to really expand our modern definition of what injury can mean in the legal system. It shows us pretty clearly that for the Romans, this abstract thing, self-worth, dignity, honor, it was treated like a real commodity, something legally defended with just as much seriousness, maybe even more sometimes, than physical property.
Yeah, Iniuria really was the Romans' complex, comprehensive answer to the problem of how you protect dignity in a legal framework. And they extended that protection incredibly broadly across the whole family, covering the living, even reaching back to protect the reputation of the dead. It was a fundamental recognition that an intangible offense, an attack on status, could inflict damage far more lasting, far more socially consequential than a simple physical blow.
And maybe the most telling feature of this whole system, the part that really reveals Roman priorities, was that reliance on the judge's discretion. That power to fine-tune the punishment, not just to fit the specific act, but crucially, to fit the social standing, the dignitas of everyone involved, victim and perpetrator. The law wasn't just enforcing rules, it was enforcing hierarchy.
Absolutely. And that inherent flexibility, that discretion, is probably why the system lasted for so many centuries. It could constantly adapt to reflect and reinforce the prevailing social order, whatever that order happened to be at the time.
Which brings us perfectly to our final provocative thought for you to chew on after this discussion. The law of Iniuria seems to demonstrate that, in Roman society, the real core of the outrage often wasn't the physical act or the specific words used. It was the public degradation, the loss of face, the loss of status.
So here's the question to leave you with. If a legal system explicitly says that the penalty for the exact same offense, say, a public insult, must be drastically different based purely on the social rank of the victim. If an elite offender gets exiled while a commoner gets sent to the mines for the same crime, what does that foundational principle really tell us about the ultimate values embedded in that legal system? Does it suggest that maybe the highest purpose of that law wasn't actually about ensuring the equality of its citizens before it, but perhaps about protecting the sanctity, the stability, and the rigid structure of its existing social hierarchy? Something to think about.